Hello, students. Today we are discussing Warren and Cheney's article, Ecological Feminism and Ecosystem Ecology. Now, I think it's easy enough to see how environmentalism can be relevant to feminism. We've already discussed some of the connections, and we'll discuss more as the semester goes along. But Warren and Cheney are primarily concerned with showing how feminism can be relevant to the more scientific side of environmentalism. Now, in their paper overall, they focus on this side of things, how feminism is relevant to environmentalism, and they go through 10 similarities in themes between feminism and a particular approach to environmentalism that they call that is standardly called ecosystem ecology, and try to show how they're mutually supportive. I think 10 similarities is a bit much to try to go through. So for our purposes, we're really only going to discuss 2 of them in any detail. But just to start off, let's very briefly go ahead and touch again on how environmentalism is relevant to feminism. As Warren and Cheney see it, there are many different kinds of ecofeminism. There are many ways that ecofeminism can be articulated, but there's 3 important commonalities, 3 things that you're going to see in really anything that deserves to be called an ecofeminist perspective. First off, all of these views are going to see parallel patterns of abuse in terms of the treatment of women and the treatment of the environment. If you don't think that there's abuse and marginalization of women, then you're not really upholding the feminist side of ecofeminism. And if you don't think that there's abuse and marginalization of the environment, then you're not really an ecofeminist or ecologist in a philosophical sense anyway. Second thing, all of the different kinds of ecofeminism understand these patterns of abuse and marginalization to be grounded in patriarchal beliefs and values. So values that uphold the power of men over women, and also the power of men specifically and humans more generally over the environment. And again, this is a set of both beliefs and values. So sometimes we have explicit beliefs that men are superior to women. Sometimes we have more implicit beliefs about just what are the appropriate roles of men and women in society or science or something like that. And then we also have value judgments about, say, the inputs of men as opposed to women. Who is it that is giving us important ideas? Who is it that's giving us important insights? Who is it that we ought to be listening to? So to some extent, these are cognitive or empirical judgments, and to some extent, these are value judgments about who has the most worth when it comes to thinking about environmental issues. And then a third form of commonality amongst all the different types of ecofeminism is that they take it as really an imperative. The way that we solve this problem of parallel forms of abuse and marginalization is to try to overcome a system of thought, or we should say really systems of thought, plural, that are androcentrist and anthropocentrist. So that is, we need to develop forms of thinking that do not have these 2 flaws. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the term anthropocentrism by now, right? That is putting humans at the center of things and everything else at the periphery. But we can also talk about androcentrism, where andro is the root of the Greek word for man. So androcentrist would mean man-centered, or androcentrism would be a view of the world that takes men to be at the center and puts women along the periphery, defines them in terms of their relations to men and things like that. So we can see how environmentalism can attached to all of these different ecofeminist or feminist more generally sort of themes and concerns. But how about feminism's relevance to environmentalism? Well, Warren and Cheney's plan is to compare ecofeminism as a philosophical view with several different versions of what's called in scientific literature ecosystem ecology. Now, there's two main versions of ecosystem ecology that are sort of the more popular views out there. One is the population community approach, and the second is the process functional approach. Population community approach focuses on organisms. It says when we're looking at the world ecologically, when we're looking at what is in an ecosystem, we focus on the organic creatures, the living things. The inorganic parts of the environment are really the background context in which the ecosystem exists. So mountains and ocean trenches, these are not part of the ecosystem. They are part of the context in which the ecosystem thrives, flourishes, or dies off. The process functional approach takes both organic and inorganic things to be actual parts of the ecosystem. So they accept the population community approach's embrace of the organic parts of the ecological system, but they insist also that we expand it out to the inorganic. So they would say, for instance, that a mountain range itself can be part of the ecosystem, not just the context in which the ecosystem lives. And on this view, what distinguishes an ecosystem, right, what makes one ecosystem what it is, a single ecosystem, distinct from any others, is that it has a sufficiently high degree of sort of cycling of energy and resources through these different components. And you can imagine how there is cycling of energy and resources from the organic to the inorganic and back. So if you take that as fundamentally an important part of how an ecosystem functions, then the process functional approach has probably kind of a grip on you. Whereas the population community approach focuses on interactions between living things. But while these are the two sort of big games in town, Warren and Cheney want to focus on a third approach, sort of the new kid on the block, which is the observation set approach. This is a theoretical framework for understanding analyses, multiple, of multiple ecosystems at the same time. So it seems that the process functional and population community approaches really focus in on one ecosystem at a time. The observation set approach would point out that there's a problem here, right? So how can it be that relative to a school of fish, the ocean's water is just a background condition, while relative to some broader perspective, say, the ocean water itself is part of the ecosystem? There are certain questions for which that first view is seemingly the right view or the better view to take if we're going to gather the kind of scientific data that we want. But there are other questions or other purposes where it seems like the second approach is going to get us the relevant data that we need. So the observation set approach says the way to resolve this tension is to deny that either one of these is the fundamentally correct approach. Rather, when we're analyzing ecological problems, the analysis is relative to a specific, what this view calls, observation set. So there are the things we are counting as observations of the relevant phenomena. Now, observations essentially make assumptions about what can appear. So when you are collecting observations, you have already imported a certain perspective, a certain lens on what can show up. But this abstract theory, like observation set approach, can then integrate these multiple sets of observations in relation to one another. So let's look a little bit more at how observation set approach might take first one perspective and then another and show why they're both equally relevant. So in case number one, let's say that what we're observing is a population of mountain goats. We're interested in their behaviors, their distinct adaptations, and so on. Well, if what we are looking at in our scientific study, if what we are observing and collecting data on is the population of mountain goats, then the elevation of the mountains that they inhabit is a background condition. It's not something that we need to observe itself. That would give us irrelevant data. It would just be a waste of time. But suppose in a different case, what we're observing is the reason why there is divergent microevolution between this population of mountain goats and another population on the other side of the mountain. If that's what we're trying to collect data on, then the fact that the mountain is tall enough and rugged enough to keep the two populations separate and expose them to different conditions, the sorts of things that lead to microevolutionary changes, well, that's not part of the background. That's part of what we're looking at. So in one case, it's only the organic that matters. In the second case, it's both organic and inorganic features that matter. But when you're picking between the two of these, you don't have to answer some metaphysical question about what the real ecosystem is. Rather, you just ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to collect data on? So just to review this again, we've got two simple big bullet points and then three points underneath each. The first thing we've touched on is important themes in ecofeminism, about the parallels in the mistreatment of women and the mistreatment of nature, these parallels being rooted in patriarchal beliefs and values, and a commitment to the solution being overcoming androcentrism and anthropocentrism. And we've got three approaches to ecosystem ecology: the population community approach that just looks at the organic members, the process functional approach that looks at both organic and inorganic constituents, and the observation set approach that says, well, what you should look at depends on what kind of data you're trying to collect. Now, we moved through this fairly quickly because this is interesting information, but it is somewhat non-philosophical. This is the scientific sort of setup for what we're going to get out of feminism and ecofeminism in particular when it comes to understanding what we're doing with these different approaches to ecosystem ecology. So now we're going to take just a brief intermission. I'm just going to sit here in silence for 5 to 8 seconds, but I encourage you to pause the video, take a break, grab a drink, or for that matter, stop the video, come back in half an hour or whenever it's convenient for you, and then we'll pick up from here. So we'll just stop for a short break here, but I encourage you to take a slightly longer break and come back. Okay, coming back from this short intermission, let's now look at what feminism has to do with these theories of ecosystem ecology. Why is feminism relevant when we're doing science of this sort? Pardon my cat's tail. So feminist philosophy has made major contributions to what's called ontology, the study of reality, the study of what exists, and also to epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and how we know things and how things are true, what it means for something to be true. specifically in terms of feminist contributions to these two major areas of philosophy, we can focus down on feminism's view on knowledge, or one standard kind of epistemology that you get out of feminism. And this is what's called standpoint epistemology. And then when we're looking at ontology and the nature of existence, one prominent view in the feminist literature is what's called relational ontology. So now we're going to go through each of these. So let's start with knowledge. How do we know things? And what exactly is standpoint epistemology? Well, standpoint epistemology emphasizes worldviews, conceptual frameworks, and the role those play in knowledge. The general idea is that you just cannot see certain facts until you come to look at the world through a certain lens. So I have a certain background that gives me certain assumptions, certain implicit maybe biases, or just baseline assumptions about how the world works. And that baseline, that standpoint, right, gives me a certain way of looking at the world that makes some facts particularly available. They're particularly easy for me to pick up on, but there are other facts that are going to be very difficult, maybe even impossible for me to pick up on. And so the idea here is that to really get at the overall truth, we're going to need different people with different standpoints all collaborating together. Similarly, when we're theorizing in the scientific field of ecology, or really any scientific field, what we can see, what we can learn, is shaped by the sets of data that you try to look at and explain. So if you're looking at relatively large objects, then Newtonian mechanics is an excellent form of physics, and it's very useful at getting you correct beliefs on how the physical world works. But when you start looking at very tiny things, or things moving very, very close to the speed of light, then everything kind of goes crazy, and Newtonian mechanics doesn't work very well, but quantum mechanics works significantly better. And yet, while quantum mechanics seems to pick up on the smallest possible level, there is nevertheless problems moving from the quantum level back up to the Newtonian level. At a minimum, it's extraordinarily difficult to keep track of all the data that you would need to do to move from, to like start at the quantum level and build up to the macro level in any accurate way. But it may also just be that Newtonian mechanics is not a shorthand for more accurate quantum mechanics, but is its own way of looking at the world that has its own advantages if you're not looking at very, very tiny things or things like that. Another way of, or one way of illustrating this is to think about the question of what is solid at the micro versus macro level. Well, at the macro level, for instance, a piece of ice is very solid. It is, by definition, water that has been frozen to a solid state. And as long as you're looking at the macro level, ice is going to function as a solid. But when you look at the quantum level, or even at a atomic or subatomic level, then it's actually quite busy, as they sometimes say. There's lots of movement of lots of things going on. There's lots of, relatively speaking, large spaces between component pieces, and we don't generally think of solid objects as having large channels through which you can move. So at a micro level, a piece of ice is not really the sort of thing that we would call solid. So is ice really solid or really not solid? Observation set theory, like standpoint epistemology, is going to say there's not a right answer to that question. It just depends on what perspective you are intentionally taking on the world, and what kind of data you're trying to collect. Now, something that is unique, I think, to feminist standpoint epistemology, and feminism is where standpoint epistemology really started and sort of its home base. Standpoint epistemology emphasizes the role of life experiences to your worldview or the conceptual frameworks that are even available to you. So, for instance, as a man, I have again had certain experiences moving throughout the world, throughout my life. That's going to make me have certain assumptions, certain biases, and that doesn't necessarily mean bias in a negative connotation. It might or might not, but there's going to be certain ways of looking at the world that just fit, so that certain ways that feel right to me at an automatic level. And not all truths are going to show up from my standpoint. So, at a minimum, there are going to be things that are very difficult for me to see, and there may even be certain truths that are just unavailable to me. The only way that I can get at those is through the testimony of other people who have grown up in other ways, had different life experiences that give them a different standpoint for looking at the world. Um, this idea now that you need people from multiple perspectives working on the same problems, I think is very, I'll say common. It's not absolutely definitional of standpoint epistemology, but it's a very standard view in the epistemology literature for anything that calls itself standpoint epistemology. I will say that's a more bold claim than anything observation set theory is committed to. So it's perfectly possible that observation set theory would say we should embrace standpoint epistemology because it helps us see how there's multiple ways of looking at the world, without any commitment to there being certain ways of looking at the world that just aren't available to all scientists. Uh, that claim is certainly compatible with observation set theory, but it's not something the view is committed to. Nevertheless, recognizing the value of standpoint epistemology helps us to see how a feminist epistemology can inform our decision of what the best ecological scientific theory is. Now, what about the nature of reality itself? Feminist ontology has recommended what's called a relational ontology. So this, again, ontology is the study of existence, what things really do exist, and what the nature of existence is. Mainstream ontology tends to try and break things down to the smallest component pieces, what are sometimes called simples, right? Things that have no further component pieces. They're just what they are all the way through, and that's that. And it says that what really exists just are the simples, the simple individual pieces. This might remind you of what deep ecology called the dominant paradigm, and we might think of some of the criticisms that deep ecology offered of this kind of break everything down to the smallest component type of view. What relational ontology tells us as a sort of sophisticated theory of reality is that we are not really isolated individual points of existence, not only at the fundamental smallest level, but our existence as human beings, say. It's going to say that what it is to be me, what it is to exist as the human being that I am, is partially determined by my relations in a complex web to other things. So my relation to my parents, to my romantic partners, my relation to you all as your professor. These are part of what make me who I am, not the simple fact that I am constituted by this collection of physical particles. If that's all you look at, you're going to miss something really fundamental about me. And the same is true for each of you. So now if we apply relational ontology to ecology, then we might say that if we understand observation set, or the observation set approach to ecosystem ecology as embracing a relational ontology, what we see is that the things out there to exist are not a pre-theoretical given. So on this break everything down to simples view, I think it is supposed to be that what exists is pre-theoretical. We come up with theories to explain the data that we see that has implications for what actually exists. But what exists and what doesn't exist is just a brute fact of the world prior to any kind of theorizing that we might do. Observation set approach, like relational ontology, says, no, what really happens is when we act as scientists, we make theory-driven choices about what to understand as an existing thing and what to understand as background context, and what it is to treat what to treat as something existing in that context. So do I exist? Well, are we looking at the context of this room that I'm in and the table that my computer is on? Then yes. If we're looking at the fundamental particles of the universe, you might well think that there's not enough coherence between the fundamental particles that constitute me for me to really be an existing thing. So this is actually a relatively popular view among mainstream metaphysicians. Is what's called Mariological nihilism. This is the idea that no two things ever constitute a larger thing. All that exists are the simples, the most basic things, and when you put them together to try and make something more complicated, you're not actually getting at the really real reality, the really real nature of the universe. Relational ontology is going to say that's just nonsense. Or rather, that's one valid way of looking at the world, but it is not the valid way of looking at the world. It is only relative to a measurement, a set of observations, that some things are individuals to exist. All right, so now just to review this again, we're looking at feminism's relevance to environmentalism and ecology as a scientific theory, and ecofeminism provides us a theory of existence, relational ontology, and a theory of knowledge, standpoint epistemology, and these things guide us as ecologists to favor one theoretical approach, the observation set approach, over the competitors that say there's only one right way to look at the world. The reason that feminism encourages us towards this observation set approach is that in terms of the theory of knowledge, it says not all knowledge is equally available to all knowers, and where you are situated affects what you can observe. This is very much like observation set theory that says what you have assumed or what you have chosen to be the data that you are looking for, that's going to determine what is out there to know. And then relational ontology is going to tell us that existence is not a pre-theoretical given, and whether something exists or not is going to depend on what you are measuring, just like observation set theory tells us as well. All right, that is what we are looking to get out of Warren and Cheney's article. These are two major ways that ecofeminism is relevant to scientific study of the natural world. And so that's going to do it for today. Thank you all.